Good morning, everyone. My name is Dalton Jenkins, and I'm going to be giving a lecture I've prepared on Chapter 35 of our textbook titled Vascular Plant Structure, Growth, and Development. First, let's talk about plant organization. So, we know that all living things are made up of cells, and that cells can come together to form cooperative units that are specialized for specific tasks, known as tissues. And tissues can come together to form organs. Organs can form organ systems together, and the collection of our organ systems forms the organism. Well, plants have a root system and a shoot system. Let's talk about the root system first. The root system is an organ system found in plants that centers around the plant's roots, as you might guess from the name. The primary root, the first root, which is also the first organ that forms from a plant embryo, is the root from which all the lateral roots branch off from. This is the primary root. There are two types of root systems. There's a taproot system, and in plants that exhibit a taproot system, the primary root typically develops into a long vertical root, which is also called a taproot, for which the system gets its name. It serves mostly to anchor the plant and allow it to grow taller so that it can better compete for light above the surface of the soil. And absorption is mostly left up to the lateral roots in this sort of system, and the primary root serves mostly just for structural support. There's also the fibrous root system. Now, in plants that exhibit a fibrous root system, the primary root will die off early on in the plant's life, and it will be replaced by smaller roots that each begin to branch until the plant has formed a thick mass of small, slender roots. Plants that exhibit a fibrous root system are typically better at preventing soil erosion. Let's move on. We'll talk about the shoot system now. Now, as part of their shoot systems, plants have organs known as stems. And they serve to support the plant to grow and arrange the shoot so that the plant has optimal access to light and CO2, like optimal conditions for photosynthesis. And they also serve to grow the plant taller for reproductive purposes so that pollen and fruit may be dispersed more easily. Stem arrangements consist of an alternation between nodes, which are the spots on the stem where leaves attach, and internodes, which are the spots on the stem where leaves do not attach. Stems have apical buds, which are sites of shoot growth that are located at the tip of the shoot, and they also have axillary buds, and those buds can potentially form a thorn or a flower, and the axillary buds are found in the upper angle formed by the shoot and a branching leaf. Also, as part of their shoot system, plants have leaves. Leaves are plant organs that belong to the shoot system and primarily serve to facilitate photosynthesis, but they also perform gas exchange, heat regulation, and some leaves have specialized adaptations to defend the plant from pathogenic organisms or herbivores. Leaves can typically be broken down into two parts. So there's the blade, which is what you think of when you think of a leaf, the flat surface, and a petiole, which is the sort of stalk on the leaf, the stem, if you would, that attaches the leaf to the plant stem at a node. We talked about earlier, we know plants have tissues and cells. Let's talk about plant tissues. Plants have three sorts of tissues. They have dermal tissue. Dermal tissue is one of the tissue types found in plants that forms the outermost surface of the plant and acts as the plant's first line of defense from outside threats. The epidermis is the outermost layer of dermal tissue. On the stems and leaves, it is surrounded by a cuticle that protects against desiccation. The next kind of tissue that's found in plants is known as vascular tissue. Vascular tissues are groups of cells that come together to form channels that facilitate the distribution of water, nutrients, and other resources. There are two different kinds of vascular tissue found in plants. We have xylem, which is responsible for the distribution of inorganic resources throughout the plant. Phloem, which is responsible for the transportation of organic resources throughout the plant. And the final kind of plant tissue is ground tissue, which is called pith if it's internal to vascular tissues, or cortex if it is external to vascular tissues. Ground tissue includes all tissues that are not vascular or dermal. And a quick note about plant cells I'd like to make is that plant cells have become specialized for the tasks they perform through a process known as differentiation. Moving on to, let's talk about meristems and plant growth. So meristems are structures that are responsible for the indeterminate growth of plants. They are regions of plant tissue that house cells that are capable of cell division. And they can be categorized as apical meristems or lateral meristems. An apical meristem is a meristem that facilitates vertical or primary growth. And this allows the plant to grow taller, perform better in the competition for light, disperse its reproductive resources more easily. Primary growth only refers to the vertical growth of plants. And lateral meristems lateral meristems, examples of which are the vascular and cork cambiums, are meristems that facilitate secondary growth, which is a growth in thickness or girth. Plants. There's two different other than. Okay. So beyond primary and secondary growth, there's two more types of growth I'd like to talk about. We have indeterminate growth. Now, if an organism is said to exhibit indeterminate growth, this means that it grows throughout its lifespan rather than growth being confined to a specific stage in its life cycle. So plants exhibit indeterminate growth. Now, there's also determinate growth, which if an organism is said to exhibit determinate growth, this means that growth is confined or limited to specific stages of its life cycle rather than growth taking place throughout the organism's entire life, like in plants. So animals, like you and I, exhibit determinate growth with our juvenile, adolescent, all those stages of our lives, and then once we reach adulthood, we typically stop growing. Let's talk some more about primary growth. Let's talk about the primary growth of plant roots. So plant roots have a structure known as a root cap, which is a product of the root apical meristem, and it serves to lubricate the soil that it surrounds the tip of the root and to protect the root apical meristem from damage as the roots extend deeper by pushing through the rough ground. So it exists to make pushing through the ground easier on the root apical meristem. And plant roots push through the ground primarily through cell elongation. Which brings me to my next point. There are three zones in the roots of cells. We have the zones of cell division, elongation, and differentiation. The zone of cell division is located just behind the root tip and includes the root stem cells as well as their products. The zone of cell elongation is responsible for most of the growth in root length because it is the site where new cells elongate, adding length to the root and pushing it through the ground. So you might think cell division is most responsible for growth, but cell division actually does not result in an increase in mass in any way. So when these new cells then elongate, that's where most of a plant's growth comes from. The zone of differentiation is where the newly elongated cells go to finish their development to specialized adult cells. And now we'll move on to the primary growth of shoots. Apical dominance is exhibited through hormonal communications within plants that inhibit the growth of new shoots from axillary buds that are more closely positioned to the apical bud. Let's move on and talk about the primary growth of shoots. As we talked about before, the shoot system includes stems and leaves of plants. So let's talk about the anatomy and growth of stems first. Stems of plants are covered in a layer of dermal tissue called the epidermis, which is in turn covered by the waxy cuticle, and that protects against desiccation. There are different types of ground tissue in the stems. There's parenchyma cells, collenchyma cells, and sclerenchyma cells, and they support the stems interchangeably during different periods of growth. And in most eudicot plant species, the vascular tissue of the stem presents a ring-shaped grouping of vascular bundles. However, in most monocots, the vascular bundles are more spread out and less uniform than in eudicots. Let's talk about the anatomy of leaves and their growth. Leaves begin to grow from structures on the stem known as leaf primordia, which are shaped like cat's ears. Stomata are another important part of leaves. They're pores found in plants that facilitate the exchanging of oxygen gas and CO2. And, that's crucial, obviously, for plants to perform photosynthesis. These pores are not found in the algal ancestors of plants, but they can constrict themselves so that plants may retain more water when in harsh conditions. Excuse me. The plants also have a sort of ground tissue called the mesophyll, and it's located within the leaves of plants, and it's sandwiched between two epidermal layers and broken down into two layers of its own: palisade and spongy mesophyll. Palisade mesophyll is positioned more closely to the upper epidermal layer that sandwiches them, more like the cheese than the meat of the sandwich, if you will. It mostly consists of photosynthetic cells, and spongy mesophyll, more like the meat than the cheese, is closer to the bottom bun of the sandwich, the bottom layer of the bottom epidermal layer. And the spongy mesophyll, it's less geared towards photosynthesis and more suited for gas exchange. Let's talk a little bit about secondary growth, so growth in thickness. The vascular cambium is a cylindrically shaped structure. It's entirely responsible for the production of secondary vascular tissue, and it's located inside the phloem and outside of the xylem. The meristematic cells of the vascular cambium divide and increase the circumference of the plant. That's how we get the growth and girth. So that's the vascular cambium. Let's talk about the cork cambium. The cork cambium is a cylindrical structure that produces cork cells that are capable of replacing parts of the epidermis that have been lost as a result of growth. And it also, these cells deposit the hydrophobic substance suberin within their walls before death. Bark is a term within the scope of plant biology, and it refers to all tissues that are situated externally to the vascular cambium, including the periderm and secondary phloem. And gas exchange in woody plants is facilitated by regions that have more space between cork cells for air to pass through, which are referred to as lenticels. Talk about growth, morphogenesis, and cell differentiation. So let's talk about model organisms. What is a model organism? They are organisms that allow scientists to conduct extensive research into biological phenomena because they are typically easy to breed and keep alive in a research area, and they may have some advantage that makes them optimal research subjects. A little note about cell division in plants. Sometimes during the cell division, the cell is divided asymmetrically, meaning that the cell has divided into two new cells of inequivalent sizes. And this asymmetrical cell division can often be a factor in determining the fate of a specialized cell, what sort of cell the new daughter cells are going to turn into. Then note about cell expansion. Cell division, as we said before, I really want to drive this point home, does not increase mass in any way and therefore is not the chief process responsible for plant growth. Rather, it is cell expansion that accounts for most of this. Morphogenesis and pattern formation. What is pattern formation? Pattern formation is the phenomenon by which specific bodily structures develop and grow in specific places every time. So you never get certain tissues in certain places, and you always get them where you do want them. There's a couple bases for the hypotheses surrounding pattern formation, how cells are. There are a few different bases for the hypotheses surrounding how the fate of a plant cell is determined during pattern formation. The first of these bases is hypotheses surrounding lineage-based mechanisms. Hypotheses made using this basis propose that a cell's fate is determined very early on, and this fate will also be passed down to the next generation spawned from this parent cell. And the next basis is position-based mechanisms. Hypotheses made using this basis propose that a cell's fate is determined by the final position it finds itself in. That is all I have for today. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.